to speak about GMAT 2018, the changes made to the test, and how they're going to affect your preparation strategies and results. First thing first, let me introduce myself. My name is Julia, and I'm the marketing manager at MBA 25. Our company has been in business for 15 years, and we work on connecting top candidates to top business schools and vice versa. So far, our offline events have been attended by over 20,000 candidates in 21 countries. We work closely with the top business schools. You can see them on the screen right now. They come from the United States all over to Singapore and Australia. We also organize traditional offline events. The calendar can be seen right here. So the upcoming events are these ones. If you have any questions about how to get an event, how to speak to a business school, you will see my contacts at the end of this webinar. So feel free to reach out to me, or I will give you more information. Today we have two speakers speaking to you about GMAT. Yaroslav Medvedev is from the MBA strategy, and Brian Galvin represents Veritas Prep. So Yaroslav comes from the MBA strategy company, our longtime partner in Europe. The company works and helps you prepare for GMAT, GRE, IELTS, TOEFL. They offer MBA application packages, consultations, and they are powered by GoGMAT platform, one of the most effective platforms currently existing in the world for GMAT preparation. So let me pass the word on to Yaroslav. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready, but I still cannot hear you clearly for some reason. All right. Now, hello everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. Right? Please write something like a plus sign if you can hear me well. Loud and clear. All right. Thank you. Okay, so today we are going to talk about 5 things. I'll go quickly through the first 4, right? Because as they already told me, you guys are familiar with the format of the exam, and we'll stop on the 5th part, the exam structure. All right. So application process. Now, all you need to know is that application process is like super easy. First, you go to mba.com website, as you see here. Then you click on the register button, and that's pretty much it. You need to input your first name, last name, email, password, and that's it. So it will take you like 10 minutes at maximum. All right, the next point. Study materials. So the main study materials that we use at MBA Strategy are GMAT official guide, right? Then GMAT prep system, and of course our official book called GMAT handbook. Here on the picture, you can see Albert Einstein, which means this is a quantitative section book. So I'm a verbal part teacher. So we have okay, we have another guy here. All right. Next. Median number of preparation hours. As you see in this chart, it takes different time for different people to prepare for the exam. Naturally, because you guys are native speakers, it takes you only like less than 40 hours in total to prepare for a GMAT exam, whereas for a guy from China, it will take like 100 hours, right? So yes, it depends a lot. So, but as one girl told me who actually got into Harvard after, she said it's never enough, right? So you need to spend as many hours as possible in preparing to GMAT, because it's a quite difficult exam, even for a native speaker, and there are a lot of things that should be taken into consideration. Right? I mean, tricky points in GMAT. Now, verbal question types. Okay, I'll go through this section briefly, very quickly, because you guys know the format already, right? So the first one is critical reasoning. What is critical reasoning? A critical reasoning question usually looks like this. We have a short text, like 3 to 4 sentences, and then, as usual, we have 5 choices, right? 5 options. Here, now critical reasoning may have assumptions in it. It may have weaken and strengthen argument part, right? It may okay, the GMAT may want you to conclude something or infer something from the text, evaluate the argument, or solve a paradox. These are the usual formats of critical reasoning. Okay, next, reading comprehension. Usually we have two major types of reading passages on GMAT. General reading and specific, right? So general usually is, it can be about nature, it can be about governments, it can be about pretty much any topic. While specific, for me, for a non-native speaker, is a bit more complicated because they will use some terms and it's a bit more complicated to understand. Well, and the last subsection of part is sentence correction. Well, sentence correction is the easiest part for a native speaker, mostly because you guys know how to speak language naturally, right? So you have an ear for it, and you can you pretty much know how to make a sentence correct without even learning any grammatical constructions, right? So you just feel the language. Well, this part is not that easy for non-native speakers, I can tell. All right, now the second part of GMAT is quantitative question types. All right, as you see, we have two subsections in quantitative sections, problem solving and data sufficiency. Well, as I'm not a quantitative section teacher, I'll just briefly go through. As you can see here, we have problem, right? And we need to pick a right number. It's for us, well, as I think it's pretty easy. Mathematics on GMAT is not very complicated. It's I would say it's high school level of mathematics, right? Of course, it depends on the question though. Now the second part is data sufficiency. Here, well, you're familiar with the format too, right? So we have 2 points here, and you need to tell whether statement 1 alone is sufficient, or statement 2 alone is sufficient, or both statements taken together are sufficient, or none of them taken together are sufficient. All right, let's go to the next part, scoring. Now, here are the two sections that are not included in your final score. So what I mean, in your final score, you'll get only quantitative and verbal parts are included in it. Now, the first part is essay writing. So you can get maximum of 6 points for the essay. Well, it ranges from 0 to 6. Usually nobody gets less than 2. But as I already mentioned, this score is not included in your total score. Same for the integrated reasoning. Maximum is 8 for it, and it is a series of questions with tables and graphs where you need to infer something from the data given. Next, verbal and quantitative score chart. Well, I don't know if you can see it well here, but the main point of of this table is to give you the understanding that it's easier to get 51 on in quantitative part than 51 in verbal. Actually, it's almost impossible to get 51. Only like 0.00000.1 percent of people can get 51 on verbal. And it's very complicated, not only for non-native speakers, but also for native speakers, because it's not only about language knowledge, but it also includes some. It takes so you need to use your logic, right, to answer these questions. For mathematics, of course, you need to use your logic too, but as I already told you, I think they are quite easy, very easier than verbal part. So as you see, 80, here's the percentile. So 88, which means 12% of all exam takers score 50 on quantitative part, which is quite a lot. It's more than 1 out of 10, right? While it's almost impossible to score 50 on verbal. Next. Now, exam structure, the main topic for today. Briefly, the exam after the April 16th was restructured a little bit, and now it's 30 minutes shorter. So now the quantitative part, it used to be 37. There used to be 37 questions in quantitative part. Now there are only 31 question, and there used to be 41 question for in verbal part, and now it's 36. So in quantitative part got reduced by 6, while verbal part got reduced by 5. All right. Now this 30-minute reduction includes 23-minute reduction in exam structure. So the questions themselves were reduced by in terms of time, by 23 minutes, and 7 minutes reduction across non-exam sections like tutorial and section introduction. All right, now the distribution of the questions is as follows. Reading comprehension is 13 to 14 questions. Then sentence correction, 12 or 13 questions. Critical reasoning, 9 or 10 questions. Then problem solving, 17, which is problem solving and data sufficiency are quantitative part, right? So 17 to 18 questions. And data sufficiency, 13 to 14 questions. The total amount of time that is devoted per question in verbal part is well, it remains practically the same. It got reduced by 1.5 seconds per question, both in verbal and quantitative. Well, roughly speaking, right? It's like 1.6 in verbal part and 1.4 in quantitative part. So for verbal section now, you guys have 108.33 seconds. Okay, let's round it to 108 seconds per question in a verbal part, and 120 seconds, or exactly 2 minutes per question in quantitative part. Now, that's pretty much it. Now, questions welcome. If you guys have any questions, please ask me. I'm willing to answer them. Okay, Jill is typing something. How to prepare a study plan. All right, so it depends. All right, so if you are preparing your study plan on your own, There are websites, a bunch of websites where you can find all the necessary information. Well, there's an easier way. You can come to MBA Strategy, and we'll develop a personal study plan for you, especially if you're taking individual classes, because individual classes are tailor-made. What I mean, you get so you can consult your teacher all the time, right? You can see your weaknesses and strengths, and the teacher will help you to work on your weaknesses. Now, you can take a test on our platform, Go GMAT, which will show, well, it has very good analytics, and you will see how many points, let's say, you get for each section, and where is your weak spot, which is the section that you need to work on. Is it possible to solve everything in the given amount of time? For example, 2 minutes per quantitative section, because some may take longer. Well, look, my advice is you need to complete the test anyway, right? Because it's better if you skip the question. I mean, like you choose the answer randomly, and then you might guess, right? Because if you just skip the question without choosing any option, then you will be the points will be how to say, you'll get less points, right? Because you'll get 0 in case you choose a wrong answer, but in case you skip the answer, you'll get like -1 or like -2. All right, and how to solve everything in a given amount of time? You just need to practice. What I did, I was just using the stopwatch, right? And I had a big, thick book, our book, handbook, right? And I was just doing it for 2 weeks nonstop. I was like solving every problem after problem and trying to do it within amount of time. Also, I could advise you to try to push the limits and do it not within 2 minutes, but maybe like 90 seconds, so you have more time for some complicated parts. Which online courses will you recommend? Oh, yeah, you're welcome. Online courses, again, I will recommend you our courses, our online courses, because well, you can get a tailor-made study plan from your teacher, and you'll get the tips that you will not find, you're most likely not find online. About other, well, because you guys are in America, right? And I'm not aware of the American market. I'm sure you have a bunch of schools there, but I honestly don't know any schools in America. Sorry, because I'm currently here in Moscow, and I'm working for the Moscow office.
So I guess we can just move on to Brian's presentation. Brian, welcome in. So if you have further questions to
Yaroslav or Brian, we can
connect
with them
and
and ask the questions after Brian's presentation,
because
his presentation might as well answer all your questions.
I hope so.
Brian?
Awesome. That's part of the plan. So thanks, Yaroslav. And yeah, we'll actually talk a little bit about pacing. I guess to the question of which online courses would you recommend? Veritas Prep is, I think, known for being pretty strong in live online classes. I'm a little bit biased working here and teaching here, but hopefully we can show you why we'd recommend that with a little bit of synergy as we work through here. So we're going to talk about the new GMAT, and I put new in quotes because ultimately it doesn't really matter if it's new. Like, that's the test that you're taking. We also mentioned the important changes that were made earlier this year. One, in terms of the number of questions, and also there's an advantage that's a little more than a year old now, where you get to pick the section order that you take the test in. They give you a menu of options. Used to be you always had to do the essay first, and then kind of build toward quant and then to verbal. Now you get to pick if you want to put the quantitative section first or the verbal section first. So that's another pretty important change. In general, and kind of the way it's been passed to everyone, is it's a shorter test, which means you can be done in time for happy hour now, so you don't have to pay as much for your celebratory beverages. It doesn't take as much out of your day. You get the half hour back. What they mentioned when they said they shortened the test was, one, it's a little bit shorter, so that's an advantage. Your brain drain doesn't go on as long. I think people really wore down toward the end of the old test, just because it was closer to a 4-hour extravaganza. Now people are out and closer to 3 hours. They also mentioned all the reduction in questions came from the unscored experimental questions. We'll talk about that here in just a second. But what that also means, a couple things that you should keep in mind, and remember, it's like a one man's trash is another man's treasure kind of situation. Whatever might be seen as a challenge could be your competitive advantage if you're ready for it, if you've thought about that ahead of time and you're ready to go. So what does it really mean to shorten tests? Well, one is pacing just got a little bit harder. The reason for that is they said, hey, we kept the average pace per question. I know, as Ivashio just mentioned, asked about the pace per question on the quant section. They kept it at exactly 2 minutes there. They kept it at exactly 148 per verbal question. But here's the fine print they didn't quite tell you. They didn't reduce the number of reading comprehension questions. If you were watching the previous presentation, you saw those are longer. There's just more words to read. They're a little bit denser. And so your pacing did get a little bit tougher because on a per question basis, there's more of the longer verbal questions than the shorter. And so that's something to consider. We'll talk about how to use that to your advantage here in just a second. And then the other one that's a little bit interesting when you look at the fact that they took that reduction out of the unscored experimental questions, and just kind of a half step back to explain those, in order to make sure when they say it's an adaptive test, and if you're doing well, you'll see harder questions. If you're doing poorly, you'll see easier questions. That's not whoever wrote its assessment of, hey, I think this is a hard question, let's call it hard, or I think this is medium, let's call it medium. They put these experimental unscored questions on the test to get actual data on, hey, how well do people do on this question? They also do it, because I know we're talking to at least a partially international audience, to make sure that it's not culturally biased. One time I wrote a question I was super proud of. You really had to understand American baseball to have to be quick at it. Well, that's not a fair question if you've got people from, if you saw that chart of how long people study, people from China and India and Europe and Africa and Latin America, it's going to be a little bit different. So they do those unscored experimental questions to see how hard the questions are and to kind of test for bias before they become live scored questions. Well, if you're a high scorer, hopefully everybody in this room is planning to do that, actually what that means is you get less of a break, because before, if you had, say 8 or 9 experimental questions, the real numbers you used to be right around there, that meant that if you're a high scorer and you saw a random distribution of experimental questions, some were going to be pretty easy, because just a random distribution means some are going to be easier than your scoring level. So you got a little bit of a breather. Every once in a while, they threw you a question that would take a 400 score 2 minutes, but it's going to take you, if you're scoring 680 or 710, it's going to take you 45 seconds. Now you get fewer of those, because more of the questions, a higher proportion of the questions count, higher proportion of them are going to be harder if you're doing well. Another thing to consider with the new test, in addition to the advantages, it's shorter, you get to pick the section order, is your margin for error goes down a little bit. There's a niceness. If you're good at what you're doing, there is a little bit of a niceness to a long test, which means, hey, if you make a silly mistake on number 4, that gets diluted pretty quickly as you're doing really well. And so what happens now is with a shorter test, you get a little bit less runway to make up for a poor start. If a couple silly mistakes early or some jitters early, and you're not on your game, then you don't have as long to catch up. You think of if you get a bad start in the 100-meter dash, usually the 100 meters, the winners get a good start. In the mile, you can have a bad start and you've got time to catch up. And so that's something also to consider with a shorter test. It just means you need to be out of the gates quickly doing well, because otherwise you may run out of time to catch up. Now, I just talked about a few problems, a few things that you probably look at and go, oh man, the test just got harder. What am I going to do about that? I don't want to give you problems without offering solutions. And again, your competitive advantage, if you're better prepared for the nuances of the updates, then you're just better than your competition. That's really what you care about, is do you have a higher score? A 720, a 730 is only really relevant if other people have scores that are lower or higher. It's kind of how do admissions officers use it. So how do you react to the fact that you get more reading comprehension per question now? A big thing is, because there's 4 passages now, and that's used to be 3 or 4, now it's definitely 4. There's a lot of reading to be done. They only give you 3 questions per passage, and what that means is don't read for detail, because you're only going to get asked a couple of things. Too often, when people are slow on the verbal section, and we've got a couple pacing related questions already, it's generally because they spend too much time reading stuff that doesn't end up mattering. And so if you're trying to really parse details, to really understand some nuances, if you're reading about immunological reactions or the privatization of public businesses in post-World War II Europe, or whatever detail, those are some official passage topics, you don't need to know those details unless they ask you. And if so, you're going to want to go back to confirm anyway. And so what you should really think about on reading comprehension is, because you're going to get so much of it, you need to read those passages. And it's kind of Joe asked how to prepare, think about a study plan. And a couple of people have mentioned stopwatches. One thing people don't do enough of is try to get themselves to read passages around 90 seconds. And if it's, closer to 2 minutes, it's not terrible. It's amazing when you watch people spend 3-4 minutes reading a passage. And again, you get 1:48 on average for these questions. If you've spent more than double that just on the passage with no questions, that's when the timing is really going to hurt you. So what you want to read for is, hey, do you know at the end of each paragraph what's it about? And anywhere you get a key structural word, a word like however, that means, hey, they're changing gears here. They started with one thought, now they said however, they're moving to another. Or also, hey, okay, they're continuing. Let me make sure I understand what happened before that. Or therefore, okay, the author's signaling a point. If you can basically say, the end of every paragraph or anytime you reach a major transition, do I know generally what this segment about? It was to introduce the old theory. It was to show a flaw in the previous theory. It was to give the author's position that more businesses should be privatized. Whatever, if you just know in basically one sentence, hey, what happened in this region, then you're going to understand the main point, and you're going to know where to go when you have to go back to get some detailed questions. And that's how you can be done in about 90 seconds. So with reading comprehension, it's a harder test. The pacing's harder on the verbal section. If you let it be harder, it just sort of means, hey, you've got to have good strategy to make sure you're not throwing way too many minutes at those passages. They're only going to ask you about 1 or 2 details. And so you might as well wait until you're asked before you really start splitting hairs on detail-related questions. One other, as we talk about questions, if you guys have questions on any of these points, fire them over. No need to wait toward the end, kind of to grab them as they come in. So that's one point. You get more reading comprehension per question, more passage reading per minute than you used to get. You've got to be ready for that, and just a good, efficient read up front, and then knowing, hey, you're going to go back and prove answers to detailed questions anyway is a competitive advantage for you. The fact that there are fewer breaks, you don't get that let up of, hey, they need to test this easy question to make sure it's easy. you're getting, if you're doing well, you're getting a lot more hard questions. You're down to about 3 experimental questions on the math section and more like 5 or 6 on the verbal, whereas it used to be closer to 10 on each. Hey, you're just, more questions count, and if you're doing well, your average question is going to be a little bit harder. How do you deal with that pacing? Well, one big, and let me even throw this one at you guys, if you've done this on other standardized tests, or if you've taken a GMAT practice test or anything like that, have you found that, man, if there were just 3 or 4 fewer questions, I would be confident. I'd be able to be comfortable. I'd be able to double check my work. I'd be able to pace myself a little bit, kind of write down every step and be methodical. But man, with that clock ticking, I'm rushing. I think a lot of people find that way, that it's just the fact that if they had 2 minutes and 20 seconds per question, it's kind of like anybody always wishes you had a little bit more time. Well, one way to do that for yourself, the fact that it's an adaptively scored test, which means if you're doing well, you're getting hard questions. If you're doing poorly, you're getting easier questions. What's really important to avoid is the trap of racing through questions you should get right and being vulnerable to silly mistakes, whether it's you didn't read the question properly, or you forgot to consider what if it were a negative and I had to flip the inequality sign, or whatever little mental mistakes that are easy to make if you're rushing. It's a way better idea, because it's adaptive, to do your absolute best job on all but 3 of the questions. So I put 28 math problems here instead of 31. You could also say to do really well on 32 or 33 verbal questions instead of rushing through all 36. Because the other danger of an adaptive test is if you're rushing and making silly mistakes, you should have got number 3 right, but you left it a step short. You solved for the wrong variable. And then number 5, you should have gotten it right, but you were racing, you tried to do quick mental math and made a mistake there instead of taking the time to write it out. Well, now all of a sudden, you are a 700 scorer, but the computer algorithm thinks you're a 600 scorer or a 580 scorer, and it's giving you questions that are more at that level. Now you got to be closer to perfect. You got to dig your way out of that hole. You just, by making some hasty mistakes, you told the computer algorithm you're not as good as you really are, and so it's giving you questions kind of that it thinks are at your level until you prove to it that you're better. Well, if you plan to guess 2 or 3 times per section, just kind of know what your weaknesses are. For some, it might be combinatorics with restraints. Any of those, how many ways can you sit these people together if Jill won't sit next to Scott or something like that? You find one of those, well, hey, if I don't see the pathway to the finish line, that's going to be one of my guesses. Or hard geometry and data sufficiencies. Actually, for me, for a handful of other instructors I've talked to, it's like, if I don't see the pathway to the finish line in the first 45 seconds, I'm probably not going to see it. So if you plan to guess, give yourself 2 or 3 free passes. What that means is you can slow down, you can double check your work, you can be comfortable and not rush. On other problems, you've saved yourself a little bit of time, which then means if you're not vulnerable to those rush mistakes early in the test, or even in the middle of the test, then the questions you guess on are probably really hard, in which case, because it's adaptive, that's okay. They're going to give you another just slightly less hard problem. If you got the time to do well on it, you're going to continue to push the ceiling of your ability level, as opposed to rushing and making silly mistakes. The most painful thing you hear as a teacher with this is somebody saying, hey, I was ready for everything. I was ready for all the hard, I did all the challenge problems, I was this and that. I just never saw those. And when you kind of go, were you rushing? Did you feel rushed? I go, yeah. And it's like, you probably made enough mistakes early, you never even got to see, you didn't earn the right to see the hard questions that you had prepared for. And so that's a pitfall that's befallen a lot of people. It's a good idea. Just let yourself know you're allowed to guess a couple times on each section. And that's not admitting defeat. That's just strategic. Knowing it's adaptive, knowing that the flip side of that is maybe making too many silly mistakes or really having to rush and getting a lot of problems wrong in a row. It's a strategic, sometimes you got to lose the battle to win the war. You talk to anybody who scored high 700s, and they're probably going to admit, way more than half of us who scored that high will admit, you had to guess a few times. It got hard because it was adaptive, and in order to not waste time on any one question, sometimes I would guess in 30 seconds and say, this one's not going to be for me, but now I've got the time to do a better job on what I wanted. Now, another one, I'm going to show you a couple of quick examples how this one works. On the verbal section, you have to be proactive. What I mean by that is don't just read and react. Too often, people will see a passage and go, okay, cool, it's about 2 different kinds of worms, one in the sea, one in the jungle. I'm going to read this and just see what I learn. Whereas being proactive means, okay, my job on this one, it's dense science, is I got to get a quick paragraph summary of each, pay attention to transitions, get in, get what I need out of the passage, get out and be ready to answer the question. Same thing with critical reasoning. Those you get one paragraph and ask you to strengthen an argument, weaken an argument, or draw a conclusion. Those are not just, hey, read and see what it's about. It's a, okay, they're asking me first read the question step. What are they asking me to do? And then once you know, okay, they're asking me to weaken a conclusion, you're going on attack. You already hate the conclusion, number one. They're asking you to weaken it. So you know your job. Proactively, you're reading like, I am not buying this argument. I'm against it. And then also, when they're asking you to weaken a conclusion, your job is to weaken an argument. Your job is to weaken the conclusion. You want to know exactly what is that conclusion. Think of yourself like a lawyer, an attorney, just sort of like, hey, that doesn't quite add up. I'm trying to find that missing link that I can exploit between the specific conclusion. The point being, and there's all kinds of question types that you'll want to be aware of these things on, you've got to be proactive. Too much time is wasted, particularly as the pacing just got a little bit harder on, hey, let me read it and see what's up. And then you read it and you don't get what you need to out of that first read. That's 30 seconds, 40 seconds that isn't value added. Well, now you just made your pacing job a little bit harder. So being proactive, mentioned the not all process of elimination. A lot of problems are know what you're looking for and go get it. I'll show you an example of that in a second, as opposed to read and then, okay, let me try on each answer choice. People spend too much time reading, too much time just thinking about answer choices that are definitely wrong because they're not proactive. And then one other big one is the quicker you can recognize. This is one at Veritas Prep. One thing we tell, I work with all of our instructors, I'm just kind of instructor development, instructor training. And the one thing that we come back to all the time, one of the things we come back to all the time is it's not enough to say, hey, it's a min-max problem, so do these steps. Hey, it's a leverage assets strategy problem, so do these steps. It's not enough to say it's this kind of problem, so here are your steps. Unless we tell you, here's how you know, here's how you diagnose it. See what they said here? That tells you for sure that you need to do these steps. And so what I mean there is you got to pay attention to quick recognition. Another place a lot of time is wasted is people are reading the problem, just kind of reacting to what they see instead of seeing those kind of common highlights. I want to show you one of my favorites in just a second. So this isn't all general. We'll show you some examples of, hey, you know what? Whenever I see this, I know what my job is. So with that in mind, let me show you guys a couple quick examples of being proactive on verbal and one takeaway strategy you can kind of own and practice a little bit. And then a common construct, I think this allows me to underline here, my best underline of all time, common constructs where if you see that, you know where the game's being played, you know what your steps are so that you get good value out of your time. One more thing here before we get into a couple of examples. The fact that there's just a little bit less runway to overcome a sluggish start. If you get off to a bad start, there's fewer questions to catch up and reprove to the scoring algorithm. No, really, I mean I'm 700. That was a silly mistake. I'm 700. Show me harder questions. I'll prove it to you. You just run out of that time. Couple big things are know your common mistakes and check for them. And that's why you may want to guess on a couple questions so that you have that extra time you need of, hey, in this type of situation, I tend to make this mistake. With me, it was data sufficiency questions. I overlook non-integers, negative numbers, and zero. I always have to double check. Okay, I think this is my answer, but what about a negative? What about zero? What about a fraction? Another one was I would solve for the wrong variable. They would ask me for how much fuel was left in the tank after a drive of a certain number of miles, and I would solve for how much fuel was used and go, cool, it's 12. I'm going to put in 12. It's, ooh, man, I got to double check on word problems. Did I answer the right question? Know your common mistakes, and this is, I think Jill asked about putting together a study strategy. One big portion of a study strategy is anytime you take a practice test, you've got to build in at least an hour to analyze what went wrong, what mistakes, do you need to double check for, what concept areas gave you the most trouble to go back and work on. Know your mistakes and then build in a little bit of time to check for them. Another important one is if you can get problems right, especially early on, get them right. And that's that don't rush because, hey, the clock's ticking. If you see a finish line, say, hey, it's going to be 3 steps of long division. I hate long division. It takes me a while, but I know that if I take these steps, I'm going to get that answer. That's not a time to rush. If you can get a problem right, get it right, because if you're rushing and making silly mistakes, then if the algorithm doesn't think you're as smart as you are, you're not going to have as many opportunities to prove it wrong. And then here's another one. I think we probably mentioned a little bit early, the idea of section select. You get to pick the order in your section. You can do the essay first, then integrated reasoning, then quant, then verbal. You could do quant first, then verbal, then integrated reasoning and essay, or you can do verbal first, then quant, then integrated reasoning and essay. Use that to your advantage. Know yourself and know, hey, if you're a slow starter or you're not a morning person and you have a morning test, do the essay first. It matters less. Give yourself a warm-up. Don't throw yourself into the heat of battle on a section that you're not as strong on when just your nature is, hey, I'm not at my best until after my first cup of coffee in the morning, until after I've sent some just follow-up emails. I'm not good until 10 a.m. Well, if you got a morning test or you're just a slow starter, put the easier section, the one that matters the least, up front so you get warmed up. On the other hand, if you're relying a lot on short-term memory, like, hey, math has never been my thing. I've done a lot of just getting, triangle side ratios and Pythagorean theorem and the quadratic formula. All these things they're short-term memory. If I don't use them in the first hour, I was looking at my flashcards one more time in my car before I went in. If I don't use them, I'll probably forget them. Well, then put math first. If you need short-term memory to kind of carry the day for you, use that to your advantage and say the stuff that is the least secure in my mind, but it's there right now, I want to use it fast. I would advocate for attention to precision in wording. So much about the verbal section is precise wording. I'm going to show you a great example in a second. Because of that, I would say, for me, I'm doing verbal first. When my mental focus is at its best, when I'm not tired and worn down from making math decisions or writing an essay or anything else, I want to be as just alert for little nuances in wording as possible on verbal. The nice thing is, Veritas Prep, if you guys want to take our practice test, I'll drop a link in there in a second. We got a free one, and you can take out. They're all built in with section select. You can try a few different ones out, just kind of see what feels like it's playing to your strengths. But use that to your advantage, because, like I said, anything that's a negative can be seen as a competitive advantage. Any little bone the test throws you as an advantage. Section select should be a little bit of an advantage if you're not thinking strategically about it, but your competitors applying to Harvard Business School or MIT Sloan or London Business School or whatever, if they're using that to their advantage, well, then you're leaving some points behind. And so use that to your advantage. Couple quick examples. Again, throw out questions if you have them. If there aren't, I kind of end up talking a little bit fast, but don't let me gloss over anything that you guys want to learn a little bit more about. I want to show you an example. This one, teacher's trick, just to get enough real estate. I just took off E. Nobody ever picks E on this one. This is an example of one of those critical reasoning problems. And what I mentioned there in an earlier slide is not all critical reasoning, actually quite a bit, more than half of critical reasoning is not process of elimination. And what's tricky on something like this is people will read this, it's a dense argument, and feel free to read along as I'm kind of warming us up here. It's a pretty dense argument, and then if you get into the answer choices, they're pretty darn dense too. And so one thing, Veritas Prep, we try to tell students all the time is, if you recognize that it's a critical reasoning problem that asks you to strengthen or weaken an argument or find an assumption, which is really sort of, you need to find that thing that the argument hinges on, so you can treat it as a weaken problem. Like, hey, without this, the argument crumbles. If it's strengthen, weaken, or assumption, you don't want to do process of elimination. What you want to do is, and I'm in fully branded right now. This is a polo shirt from the Gap. You want to do critical reasoning the way I shop for clothes, which is find the gap in reasoning. We're going to talk about that in just a second. So read proactive. As soon as you realize that strengthen, weaken, or assumption, you don't like the argument, you're looking for a hole in it. And if you can recognize the gaps, so one, find the gap. Two, give yourself a shopping list. Know what you're shopping for. Once you've found that gap, and I'll show you what that can be here in just a second, once you've found that gap, then you're shopping the answer choices. You're not reading every one and saying, okay, let me read this totally impartial, give me 30 seconds to really think about this one, see if it's right or wrong. You're looking at it like you're trying on stuff at the Gap. Like, hey, I came for khakis. And so when I walk past sweaters and socks, and that's not what I'm looking for. That's not what I'm looking for. But okay, this is what, now it's khakis. Now I'm paying attention. Now I'm trying them on. And maybe you don't find anything that fits and you have to go back. But 9 times out of 10, if you know what the Gap is and you've got a shopping list on the answer choices, you'll find it. So step 1 is find the Gap. Talk about that, and I'll show you kind of where the Gap is in this one. 2, have your shopping list and kind of go looking for what you want and only try it on if it fits your shopping list. And 3, I think, is pretty important. Get the hell out of there before they can sell you something you don't want, right? It's like bad shoppers go into a store looking for a polo shirt and they come back with $300 worth of stuff they didn't need. That costs you a little bit of money. On the test, if you let them talk you into bad answer choices, you come away with wrong answers, with wasted time, and you're not getting your efficient best score. So in this argument, if you've been reading along, give you a little bit of a head start here. The conclusion here is those consequences will not be our fault. Right? And we talk in the Veritas Prep, how do you find conclusions? One big one is they need to depend on something else. And so we've got that word since here showing us that the conclusion is dependent on other facts. So in the beginning, we're saying, hey, they're saying that our quotation is distorted and there's going to be some consequences, but our conclusion is they're not our fault. Why are those consequences not our fault? Well, we've got evidence that our quotation was an acceptable translation, and journalistic principles say you can't be blamed if your reporting is accurate. Well, here's a wordplay gap, and it's one of the common gaps we talk about a lot in the Veritas Prep course. It's kind of how do they make these questions? They pass off 2 things as the same when they're different. The one thing we have going for us is our quotation was an acceptable translation, but the rule we're trying to employ here is that we can't be blamed if our reporting is accurate. And so the gap is, hopefully you guys see this, translation is not the same thing as reporting. Our translation could be right, but we dictated the remarks wrong. We lied about what he said and then translated that lie right. Well, that doesn't mean our reporting was accurate. So if you see that gap, and one gap to look for is, hey, they're trying to say these 2 things are the same, but they're not. 2 words that are similar, but not. Well then, hey, the gap I'm looking for is translation is not the same thing as reporting. Well then if you look at answer choice, look at answer choice A, the confirmation that the translation is acceptable is sufficient to show that it was accurate reporting. If you've got your shopping list, if you took the time to understand the argument and you say, hey, wait a second, yeah, it is assuming that. Because if you take that away and say, no, it's actually, the translation doesn't have anything to do with the reporting. If you kind of take the inverse of this one, well, then it shows that the argument's flawed. That's the idea of being proactive. And obviously it's tricky with, one example, not a lot of time with you guys, and this is a pretty hard problem. I wanted to show an example of a hard one. These are dense. If you're just kind of trying to understand, just sort of casually, what the paragraph's about, and then go and process elimination, here, I think these are hard, even you look at the words they give you, Parit and Kinko, and they're hard to pronounce in your mind. It's dense. If you know what the gaps are, and there's some common gaps you can learn to spot. Wordplay, correlation, causation, data flaws. They used an exact number when they should have used a percentage, or they didn't compare equal groups. Those kind of data flaws. If you know what gaps to look for, you can be proactive. You kind of know, okay, it's a wordplay gap. I want to find an answer that says it's an assumption, so I need to link the gap together. I want to show them that says, these 2 things, you can use them as each other, even though they're not the same. That's how you can be proactive there. So bigger than just this question, the goal, how do you make up for the lost time you're going to have because they add more reading comprehension to verbal, and it's harder to get through than it used to be. Well, one of those things, the more proactive you are, the more you're attacking these arguments, looking for gaps first, and then spending way less time densely reading, poring over answer choices that don't matter. If you've got a shopping list, one thing that's great when you watch students who are doing it this way, they know the right answer. As soon as they see it, they go, okay, yeah, that definitely deals with my gap. You can be in much more efficient shape that way. So that's a verbal example. One technique, be proactive on verbal by hunting for gaps on critical reasoning. Here's an example, one of my all-time favorite I was just finishing up a class I taught the other night. We actually already, it was like less than a week old. We've already got 1/700 under our belt, so it was pretty successful. And the class was always laughing at my desert island GMAT problems of, hey, if I could only go to the desert island with 5 GMAT problems, this would be on the list. This is one of my, like they say with albums or something, this is one of my desert island GMAT problems. I want to show you what's going on here. It's data sufficiency. If you're unfamiliar, the answer choices are always the same. They're asking you, when do you have enough information to guarantee exactly one answer to this question? And so here's the question. They give us the graphic. If these two triangles are each equilateral, what is the sum of the perimeters of the two triangles? Then they give us 2 pieces of information. And the one thing I want to point out here is recognition was the point I made on quant. If you can teach yourself to recognize, oh, I know where they're going with this. You have a head start. You're ready to attack. Here's what's interesting on this one. I think the next one, I'm going to show you the statistics. This one comes from our practice test. You can see way more than half of people pick C and get it wrong, thinking you need both pieces of information, and only a little more than a quarter pick A and get it right. And what's interesting about that one, I think I've got a breakdown here. Just kind of want to show you guys what's the recognition and how do you get there. Look at what they asked. They asked for the sum of the perimeters of the two triangles. They didn't ask for the perimeter of the small one or the perimeter of the large one or one side versus another. What happens when people think you need both pieces of information, what they're looking for is they see statement 1, this AE, this bottom one is 25 meters, and they say, okay, well, I know all the way along the bottom it's 25, but I don't know how to break that up. I can't get what is AC so that I can get the perimeter of the small one. I can't get CE so I can get the perimeter of the big one. I don't know how to break it up. Statement 2 helps because it tells me how to break it up. But when you see them ask, and this is the important recognition, this one's huge. Please write this one down. Use it on your next practice test. I promise it will save you time, give you right answers. If they ask for a combination of variables, if they ask what is X, you just have to try to solve for X. If they ask what is X minus Y, right, a combination of variables, they always make it easier to solve straight for the combination, even if you can't get the individual parts. So the mistake that people make here, and again, I'm going to show you guys the statistics because they're so powerful, people go crazy for this trap answer here and spend more time doing it, is people are trying to solve for each perimeter individually and then add them together. But if you recognize, oh, it's one of those combination questions. They're asking me to solve for a combination of variables. My goal is going to be, let me write down. As soon as you know that, what would I need to be able to get that combination? Sum of the perimeters is 3 small sides plus 3 big sides. Your recognition tells you got to put in some work here. Well, then what does statement 1 give you? It gives you 1 of each. If you need 3 of each, you just triple it, and it's sufficient. And so the other, recognition, this is one example, but if you see that kind of insight, and I think Joe was asked, what online courses would you recommend? The reason I would recommend ours, one is because I work here and I'm proud of it. I'm proud of what we do. But I think if you go with a company, an instructor that's been teaching for a while, there's that powerful insight you just can't pick up on your own. It's certainly possible to study on your own for these things, but if you don't have, that kind of insight takes a while to figure out. If you got that insight of, hey, if they do it this way, it's a standardized test, they write them the same way. This one was about geometry. They may have another one that's about algebra or probability. But if they ask you for a combination, as one example, you know what they're going for. And I was like this Rolling Stones lyric here. You can't always get what you want. When they ask for a combination, people want to fill in the whole picture. But if you try sometimes, and that's important, if they ask you a combination question, you got to roll up your sleeves a little bit and say, okay, what's it going to take? I got to do some algebra. I need to do some work to get directly to the combination. You find you get what you need, and that kind of recognition is really huge. So with that in mind, I think we can kind of summarize overall. We can kind of, I probably used a decent amount of time. We turn it over, but around for questions for sure. And yeah, I think that's all I got.
Brian, thank you
very much.
Yeah, of course.
Do we have any questions?
Coming?
Yeah, good question. Do you get pen and paper? The answer is yes, with a little bit of a but. People like to cheat on tests like this, and so you actually don't get pencil and paper. They give you these laminated spiral bound note boards, they call them, so that you can't fold it up and put it in your pocket when you're done. So you do get some scratch work if you need more. If you write big, or make some calculations that are longer and whatever, you can just raise your hand and they'll bring you another one. So you get a note board and a marker. The other thing to keep in mind, the fact that it's a marker, is you teach enough test prep, you realize anytime you're holding with the ink side down. Definitely have talked to students who are holding it ink side up, the ink all drained to the bottom. They go to write, and they would have gotten, they're panicked, like, oh no, it's not writing well. So that's a simple question. You get a long-winded answer, but you do get the ability to do your scratch work. It's just not classic pencil and paper, because people like to fold that up and then post the questions they saw on the internet, which you're not allowed to do. Scott had a great question. Will there be more data from GMAT on whether or not section order matters for your score? They have released. So the reason they did that section select is they did a study on, in a pilot program, does it change scores? And their data came back that it didn't. What's the Mark Twain? Not that they're lying. I shouldn't say they're lying. Mark Twain has that quote. There's 3 types of lies, damn lies, and statistics. And just kind of the way you do it. I think. Statistically, there may not be. The people, the pool of people who did this test versus, with quant first versus this pool who did verbal first versus this one, there may not have been differences between all those, but that doesn't mean, so on an aggregate level, maybe it doesn't. I think if placebo effect and confidence matter a lot. If you go in thinking, yes, this is my best chance to succeed, that's worth something. So statistically, the way they ran their numbers, they didn't see an advantage. But one of the reasons they don't even do demographic information before the test anymore is just reminding people, if they're part of a demographic group that doesn't do well on a test, it actually gets into their psyche and statistically they underperform. Even if it's just feeling a little more in control, there's an advantage for sure. So definitely use it to your advantage. To your question of will there be more data, I think they're pretty happy with the data they have. So they did offer data that it's because the classic test used to always be analytical writing first, then integrated reasoning, then quant, then verbal. And there's 3 choices you can have. I think it's 11% of people kept the classic version. Almost everyone does quant or verbal. That's official data. Almost everyone does quant or verbal first. So kind of shows you that the marketplace thinks that there is a little bit of an advantage. Bachelor's question: do you think the official guide plus the online access is sufficient? People definitely do that. I'll say it's not insufficient. And the double negative has a little bit of a purpose there. Everybody's a little bit different. And so I think there are quite a few people, years ago, first time I took it, that's basically what I did, for a week or so. Just kind of, okay, what kind of questions do they have? And did pretty well with just that. The limitation to just using that is it's a little bit of a regression to the mean in terms of problem difficulty, where the official guide is retired questions, and they retire questions once they've been seen so many times. And just you look at a bell curve, the problems in the middle get seen a lot. It's when somebody is scoring low, kind of moves their way up and then gets knocked back down. Somebody scoring low makes a couple, or high, makes silly mistake or two, has to see some average level questions to dig their way back up. So they retire a lot more questions in the middle of the bell curve. And so one kind of common complaint from people looking for scores around 700 is they, just the official guide probably, you see some hard questions, but not as many. And so that's where, sometimes people feel the need to move out and check out other resources. But the official guide is a phenomenal resource. Plenty of people use that to study. I guess the 2 limitations. One is it does regress toward the mean difficulty-wise, and so you may get a little bit of an inflated sense of your abilities if you're crushing average level questions, but not seeing as many of the type that you'll see on test day if you're performing well. The other one is, and GMAT will say this, they don't teach strategy. So, even their explanations a lot of times are matter-of-fact ways to prove what the right answer is, but they're not strategic in nature. And so it's great for practice. And if you're a good self-studier and kind of have that analytical mind of taking inventory for yourself of here's how I should do these problems in the future, that's great. If you want a little more strategic guidance, the official guide is self-admittedly they don't really teach strategy. Oh yeah, of course. Well, like I mentioned, if you wanted to play around with section select, if you go to that link I dropped in, we've got a free practice test. You can check that out, and pretty well scored. We actually worked with the guy, Dr. Rudner, who wrote the scoring algorithm for the official test. Once he retired from GMAT, was doing a little bit of consulting with us. So it's pretty well scored, pretty accurate representation of what the test will feel like. So if you want to check out practice test to kind of get started on your study journey, would highly recommend that. There's plenty more insight where that came from, but without getting too salesy here, just thanks everybody for giving us the time and the opportunity. Thanks to Yulia for organizing and setting all this up, and best of luck to everybody, and we hope to see you in a Veritas Prep class soon.
Any other questions? So thank you very much for your participation. Thank you for the valuable presentations you've shared with us today, connected with us today during this webinar. Please feel free to reach out to me or to the speakers if you have any further questions. We're going to record and post this video on our website. If you need access to it or cannot find the link, please get back to me. I will be happy to help you. And it was a pleasure having everyone here today. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.